Boom! Rainbow powder exploded everywhere as the white Mercedes crashed through my lawn again. Diane Wilson's perfect hair transformed into a cotton candy nightmare. Her designer suit ruined beyond salvation. Her enraged screams echoed through the neighborhood. My car, my clothes, I'll destroy you. As she emerged looking like she'd been attacked by kindergartners with finger paints. 6 months of watching this HOA dictator deliberately tear up my property while threatening neighbors had led to this perfectly engineered moment. The gathering crowd, her former victims, couldn't hide their delighted smiles. She thought she was untouchable in our community. She was wrong, dead wrong. Where are you watching this neighborhood showdown from? Drop a comment. I bet you fantasized about standing up to the entitled tyrant in your life too. It all started 6 months ago when I bought my first house after my divorce. Meadow Creek Estates seemed like the perfect place to rebuild my life. A quiet suburban community with well-maintained lawns, friendly neighbors, and enough space for me to create a home office for my remote programming job. The modest 2-story colonial with its spacious front yard had immediately felt like mine, a sanctuary where I could finally settle down and create something beautiful after years of apartment living and the turbulence of a failed marriage. I'd spent the first month meticulously planning my garden, researching native plants that would thrive in the local climate, and designing a layout that would transform the plain lawn into a vibrant oasis. On my second weekend, as I was setting up my garden tools in the garage, a middle-aged woman in designer clothes approached with what I'd soon recognize as her trademark fake smile. "Welcome to Meadow Creek. I'm Diane Wilson, president of our Homeowners Association," she announced, extending a manicured hand while her eyes scanned my property with clear disapproval. "I wanted to personally deliver our neighborhood guidelines. We take great pride in maintaining certain standards here." She handed me a binder thick enough to be a small town phone directory filled with rules covering everything from acceptable paint colors to the maximum height of garden gnomes. I thanked her politely, thinking she was just being thorough, completely unaware of the nightmare that would unfold. The trouble began 3 weeks later when I noticed tire tracks cutting across the corner of my front lawn. At first, I thought it might be the mail carrier taking a shortcut or some neighborhood kids messing around. But after setting up a small security camera, well within the HOA guidelines for unobtrusive security measures, I discovered the culprit. Diane Wilson herself driving her white Mercedes SUV across my property as a shortcut to drop her daughter at school. The video showed her doing this not once but multiple times per day on her way to school, returning home, heading out for lunch, and again for afternoon activities. Each time her tires dug deeper into my carefully cultivated lawn, destroying grass I had just planted. When I approached her about it the following day, as she was getting into her car, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand. "Oh, it's just a little patch of grass. The previous owners never complained about it. Besides, it saves me almost 2 minutes not having to go around the corner." Her tone made it clear this wasn't up for discussion. When I persisted, pointing out that she was damaging my property, her demeanor shifted instantly. "You know, I couldn't help but notice your garden layout doesn't conform to Section 7 of our landscaping guidelines. I'd hate to have to issue a violation notice to someone who's just moved in." Frustrated, I called the local police to report the property damage, but was surprised when Lieutenant James Miller arrived instead of a patrol officer. He barely glanced at the tire tracks before dismissing it as just a minor neighborhood dispute that didn't warrant police intervention. As he was leaving, I overheard him on the phone with someone saying, "Don't worry, DY. I took care of it." Later, I would learn from neighbors that Lieutenant Miller was Brian Wilson's cousin, Diane's husband, explaining why my legitimate complaint had been brushed aside so easily. That evening, my neighbor Michael Thompson stopped by with a homemade lasagna as a belated welcome gift. Michael, a high school science teacher with a kind face and nervous demeanor, seemed hesitant as he sat at my kitchen counter. "I saw Diane at your place earlier, and then the police car," he said, picking at the label on his beer bottle. "Just wanted to make sure everything's okay." When I explained the situation, his expression darkened. "Listen, you need to be careful with Diane. She's been running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom for years. The Reynolds family who lived here before you moved out because of her, and they weren't the first." Michael went on to share stories about how Diane had systematically targeted homeowners who challenged her authority, using selective enforcement of HOA rules, spreading rumors, and manipulating the board to issue fines until people either fell in line or moved away. As Mike was leaving, he offered to help me prepare a formal complaint to the HOA board. "It probably won't go anywhere since she controls most of the votes, but it creates a paper trail that might be useful later." His warning left me unsettled, but also determined. I'd moved here for peace and stability, not to be bullied by some power-hungry HOA president. That night, I stayed up late, reading through the massive HOA rulebook, looking for either ammunition or protection, and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake buying a house in Diane Wilson's territory. The morning after Michael's visit, I decided to take more concrete action. I installed additional security cameras around my property, carefully positioning them according to HOA guidelines about aesthetic compatibility with architectural features. I made sure they would capture any vehicle crossing my lawn from multiple angles with timestamp and clear vehicle identification. I also started documenting every instance of Diane's trespassing, creating a spreadsheet with dates, times, and estimated damage to my property. If she wanted to play by the rules, I would make sure I had overwhelming evidence of her breaking them. The cameras lasted exactly 2 days before I received an official HOA violation notice taped to my front door. It cited Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Community Guidelines, no visible surveillance equipment that detracts from the neighborhood aesthetic. The notice included a $75 fine and a 48-hour removal requirement. What bothered me most wasn't the fine, but the timing. Diane must have been watching my house closely to notice the cameras so quickly. I checked my footage, and sure enough, she had driven by slowly that morning, stopping briefly to take pictures of my house before continuing on her way. The level of scrutiny felt invasive, almost predatory. Michael helped me draft a formal appeal and suggested I meet with Thomas Anderson, a retired attorney who had served on the original HOA board years ago before Diane took over. When I called him, Thomas invited me over that same afternoon. His home was at the far end of the neighborhood, a well-maintained colonial with the kind of garden I aspired to create. Inside, the walls were lined with legal books and framed photos of Thomas with various politicians and judges from his days practicing law. At 75, he still had sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. "So you've become Diane's new project," he said, pouring us both cups of coffee in his sunlit kitchen. "I've been watching this pattern for nearly a decade now. She needs someone to control, someone to make an example of, gives her purpose." He flipped through the HOA guidelines I brought along, stopping occasionally to make notes. "The problem with these rules is that Diane has been quietly amending them for years. See this section about surveillance? The original language only prohibited cameras pointed directly at neighbors' properties. She's broadened it significantly." Thomas explained how Diane had gradually consolidated power by replacing board members with friends and allies, rewriting rules without proper notification, and selectively enforcing regulations against those who questioned her. Armed with Thomas's insights and Michael's support, I attended the monthly HOA meeting held at the community center that weekend. About 30 homeowners were present, sitting in neat rows of folding chairs as Diane conducted the meeting from a small podium, flanked by 4 other board members who rarely spoke. When the floor opened for community concerns, I stood and calmly presented my evidence about Diane repeatedly driving across my lawn, complete with video footage I played from my laptop. According to Section 3 of the HOA guidelines, no homeowner shall cause damage to another resident's property, I quoted. "I'm simply asking that this rule be enforced and that I be compensated for the damage to my lawn." The room fell silent as Diane's face flushed with anger. She quickly composed herself, forcing a tight smile. "Mr. Turner, while we appreciate your enthusiastic participation as a new resident, there are proper channels for these kinds of complaints. Your unauthorized surveillance equipment violates our guidelines, and I've personally received no prior notification of your concerns before you decided to make this public spectacle." Her voice was controlled, but cold. "Additionally, the access path across that corner has been an informal community easement for years. Perhaps if you'd been more interested in integrating into our community rather than policing it, someone would have explained that to you." Several board members nodded in agreement, but I noticed a few residents exchanging uncomfortable glances. One woman in particular, Samantha Harris, seemed to be studying Diane with a thoughtful expression. I would later learn she was not only a board member, but also had legal background as a former court clerk. As the meeting moved on to other business, I felt both frustrated and oddly encouraged. Diane might control the board, but her dismissive response had made her look petty in front of her neighbors. I'd planted a seed of doubt, even if it was a small one. The next morning, I discovered that Diane had escalated her lawn crossing from once or twice daily to deliberately driving over the same path multiple times, leaving deeper ruts in the grass. It was a clear message: challenge her authority, and things would only get worse. Michael stopped by that afternoon, having heard about the meeting. "You made an impression," he said. "People are talking. Diane usually shuts down complaints so fast no one notices, but you got under her skin." He helped me brainstorm next steps, suggesting we start documenting all of Diane's HOA violations, her oversized holiday decorations that stayed up weeks past the allowed time frame, her non-regulation mailbox, the fence around her pool that exceeded height restrictions. That evening, Thomas called with additional advice. "You need to think like your enemy. Diane cares about two things: her image in the community and her position of power. The annual HOA board election is coming up in 2 months. That's when she's most vulnerable, when she needs to appear reasonable and effective. That's your window." With that strategy in mind, I began methodically collecting evidence and quietly connecting with other homeowners who had fallen victim to Diane's selective rule enforcement. I was no longer just defending my lawn. I was building a case against a neighborhood tyrant who had gone unchallenged for far too long. After a week of documenting Diane's continued trespassing, I decided to try a different approach. The HOA guidelines allowed for decorative borders to enhance landscape features, so I installed a low ornamental fence around my front yard. Nothing aggressive, just a simple white picket border, fully compliant with HOA specifications on height, material, and color. I even submitted the proper paperwork to the Architectural Review Committee before install. It served a dual purpose: protecting my lawn while testing whether Diane would respect a physical barrier where she'd ignored my verbal requests. I got my answer the very next day. While I was working in my home office, I heard a crash followed by the sound of a car accelerating. My security camera feed showed Diane's Mercedes deliberately plowing through a section of my new fence, splintering the pickets before speeding away. The message was crystal clear. No barrier would stop her. This time I not only called the police, but also recorded video of the damage on my phone, and contacted several neighbors to witness the destruction before it could be denied. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Miller showed up again, clipboard in hand and a bored expression on his face. "Look, Mr. Turner, I understand you're upset about your decorations, but unless you have clear evidence that this was intentional, I can only file this as a minor traffic incident." When I showed him the security footage of Diane deliberately aiming for the fence, he squinted at my phone and shrugged. Could be avoiding an animal in the road, could be a steering malfunction. Without her statement, I can't determine intent. It was obvious he had no intention of holding Diane accountable regardless of evidence. As Miller was leaving, Michael arrived with his teenage daughter, who had been practicing soccer in the nearby park. "Fence trouble?" he asked, eyeing the damaged pickets and the retreating police car. When I explained what happened, Michael's usual anxious demeanor gave way to genuine anger. "This has gone too far. She can't just destroy people's property and get away with it because her husband's cousin carries a badge." He helped me repair the broken section of fence, while sharing how Diane had recently threatened one of his students, the daughter of a family who had supported me at the HOA meeting, with removal from the science fair committee if her parents continued to associate with troublemakers. That evening, I received an unexpected visit from Samantha Harris, the HOA board member who had seemed skeptical of Diane during the meeting. "I'm here unofficially," she explained as I offered her coffee in my kitchen. "What happened to your fence today? It's not right, and it's not the first time Diane has taken things too far." Samantha revealed she had been quietly documenting irregularities in how the HOA was run, particularly concerning financial decisions that Diane made unilaterally. The problem is most board members are either her friends or too afraid to challenge her. But there are more homeowners getting frustrated. You're just the most visible one at the moment. The next day, I found an official notice from the HOA taped to my repaired fence. It claimed my unauthorized structure violated Section 8 of the landscaping guidelines and demanded immediate removal plus a $150 fine. I checked the guidelines again. My fence was fully compliant with the written rules. When I called Thomas to discuss it, he wasn't surprised. Diane often cites rules that don't exist or applies interpretations that aren't written down. She's counting on people not checking the actual documentation. Taking Thomas's advice, I requested a formal property inspection with the entire HOA board present, not just Diane. On the scheduled day, 5 board members, including Diane and Samantha, walked my property line, clipboards in hand. Diane pointed out numerous supposed violations. My garden beds were 2 and 2 wide. My mailbox post was the wrong shade of white. The new security cameras were invasively positioned. Each alleged violation came with its own fine totaling nearly $800. Throughout the inspection, Diane maintained a smug smile, clearly enjoying the process of finding fault with every aspect of my property. When the board members left, I immediately checked my security footage. Sure enough, it showed Diane returning alone about 20 minutes later, measuring several areas and taking additional photos. When I reviewed the final violation notice that arrived the next day, it included 3 items that hadn't been mentioned during the official inspection. Violations Diane had manufactured after the fact. The dishonesty was stunning, but also gave me something concrete to challenge. I called Samantha, who confirmed the additional violations weren't discussed during the official inspection, and agreed to bring it up at the next board meeting. That night, I sat on my back deck, contemplating whether this fight was worth it. The financial cost was mounting. My work was suffering from the constant distraction, and the stress was taking a physical toll. For a brief moment, I considered cutting my losses and selling the house. But then I thought about what that would mean. Allowing a bully to drive me from my home, just as she'd done to others before me. Besides, who would I be selling to? Some other unsuspecting family who had become Diane's next target. No, running away wouldn't solve anything. The problem wasn't my house, or my fence, or my cameras. It was Diane Wilson and the unchecked power she wielded over the neighborhood. Thomas called as if sensing my moment of doubt. "Don't give her what she wants," he said firmly. "That's how she's won all these years, by making it easier to leave than to fight. But you've already done something different. You've made it public. You've got documentation. And you're not alone anymore." He was right. Between Michael's friendship, Samantha's inside position on the board, and the growing number of neighbors who had quietly expressed support, I had resources the previous homeowners hadn't. Plus, I had one advantage Diane couldn't have anticipated. As a programmer who worked with security systems, I knew how to gather, organize, and utilize digital evidence in ways she couldn't easily counter. As Thomas and I discussed strategy, he mentioned the upcoming annual HOA meeting where board positions, including the presidency, would be up for vote. "Diane is particularly anxious about this year's election," he explained. "Usually it's a formality, since no one runs against her, but there's been talk that Samantha might challenge her this time. That's why Diane's been so aggressive lately. She's sending a message to anyone who might think of opposing her." This information gave me a timeline and a potential opportunity. If I could hold out until the election and help build support for Samantha or another candidate, we might actually change the power structure that had allowed Diane to terrorize the neighborhood for years. With renewed determination, I began planning my next move. Not just to protect my property, but to expose Diane's abuse of power to the entire community. Over the next 2 weeks, I adopted a more strategic approach. Instead of just defending against Diane's attacks, I began systematically documenting every HOA violation on her property and throughout the neighborhood, particularly focusing on how rules were enforced differently, depending on who was involved. I discovered Diane's close friends routinely violated guidelines with impunity. Oversized play structures, non-approved paint colors, prohibited fence styles, while others received immediate citations for minor infractions. Most revealing was Diane's own property. Her designer landscaping exceeded height restrictions, her exotic non-native plants violated the approved species list, and her driveway had been widened beyond permitted dimensions without architectural committee approval. I created a detailed spreadsheet cross-referencing violations with the specific HOA rules they broke, complete with photographic evidence and timestamps. But instead of filing official complaints, I quietly shared my findings with Samantha, who incorporated them into her own growing dossier of Diane's selective enforcement. Michael proved invaluable in connecting me with other homeowners who had grievances against Diane's leadership. We began meeting discreetly at different houses, sharing stories and documentation. Jessica Parker, a chatty neighbor known for keeping track of neighborhood gossip, revealed that Diane had been diverting HOA funds to pay for personal landscaping services, disguising them as common area maintenance. Another homeowner, an accountant, had noticed discrepancies in the annual financial statements, but had been shut down when he raised questions at previous meetings. Most surprising was when Brian Wilson, Diane's husband, showed up at Michael's house one evening while several of us were gathered there. "I'm not here officially," he said, looking uncomfortable in the doorway. "But I saw what happened with your student Michael. That crosses a line." Brian revealed he had discovered some concerning documents at home, receipts for personal purchases made with the HOA credit card. emails threatening homeowners with made-up violations if they question Diane's decision. I've defended her behavior for years, telling myself she was just passionate about maintaining neighborhood standards. But this is something else entirely. With Brian reluctantly sharing insider information, and Samantha providing access to official HOA documents, we pieced together a troubling picture of financial mismanagement, abuse of power, and outright fabrication of rules. Diane had essentially been running a small-scale extortion scheme, using fines and threats to control residents while skimming HOA funds for personal benefit. The annual HOA fees had increased by 40% over 5 years, supposedly for community improvements that never materialized. Meanwhile, Diane stepped up her campaign against me. My mailbox was mysteriously damaged 3 times in a week. Anonymous complaints were filed about noise from my property at times when I wasn't even home. Flyers appeared on neighbors' doors, warning about declining property values due to unauthorized modifications with a photo of my house. And of course, she continued driving across my lawn daily, creating deeper ruts with each passing. When I installed motion-activated sprinklers as a deterrent, she simply drove through them, laughing visibly from her car as she got soaked. The neighborhood's annual 4th of July barbecue became the next battleground. As HOA president, Diane controlled the invitation list and deliberately excluded me along with several other problem residents who had questioned her authority. But Michael, as part of the event committee, ensured we received unofficial invitations. Everyone contributes food anyway, he explained. She can't actually stop anyone from attending a community event at the public park. I spent the night before the barbecue preparing detailed information packets exposing Diane's HOA violations and financial irregularities, disguising them as festive event programs. When I arrived at the park, Diane immediately confronted me near the entrance. "This is a private neighborhood function," she hissed, blocking my path. "You weren't on the approved list." I maintained a pleasant smile, aware that several neighbors were watching. "Actually, Diane, Section 12 of the HOA bylaws specifies that all community events held in public spaces must be open to all residents. I brought extra copies if you need a refresher." I offered her one of my information packets, which she snatched and then blanched upon seeing the contents. Throughout the event, I circulated among neighbors, having friendly conversations while distributing my event programs. The reaction was mixed. Some residents seemed shocked by the revelation. Others nodded knowingly, as if confirming long-held suspicions, and a few nervously distanced themselves, clearly afraid of being seen associating with me. Diane watched from the periphery, her face growing increasingly flushed as she realized what was happening. Finally, as the fireworks display was being set up, she stormed over to where I was chatting with an elderly couple. "How dare you spread lies about me at a community event," she shouted, drawing attention from everyone nearby. "This is defamation. My husband is a lawyer, and I will sue you for every penny you have." Maintaining my composure, I responded calmly. "Everything in those packets is factually accurate and documented. Diane, if you'd like to discuss specific points you believe are incorrect, I'm happy to review them with the entire neighborhood right now." Her eyes darted around at the gathering crowd, realizing she had created exactly the public scene I had hoped for. Without another word, she turned and marched away, but not before declaring loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This isn't over, Turner. One way or another, you will be out of this neighborhood by summer's end." Her threat was meant to intimidate, but it only strengthened my resolve. That evening, as fireworks exploded overhead, I sat with Michael, Samantha, and several other neighbors, planning our next steps. "The annual meeting is in 3 weeks, Samantha explained. "That's when we can force a vote of no confidence and potentially remove her as president." But we all knew Diane wouldn't go down without a fight, and her vindictiveness would only increase as the meeting approached. I needed to be prepared for whatever she might do next. Later that night, Jessica Parker called with unsettling news. She had overheard Diane telling another board member that she planned to conduct a surprise inspection of my house the next day, citing an anonymous complaint about code violations that could potentially result in city involvement, not just HOA penalties. This escalation was concerning. Diane was now willing to use governmental authorities as weapons in our private dispute. I spent the night securing my property and preparing for her visit, but also thinking about a more dramatic response. If Diane was determined to cross my boundaries literally and figuratively, perhaps it was time to create a more memorable consequence than a simple sprinkler system. Back at home, I began researching non-toxic biodegradable colored powders used for everything from color runs to gender reveal parties. As a programmer with a background in mechanical engineering, I started sketching designs for a press-sensitive distribution system that would activate only under the weight of a vehicle, not a person or animal. I called it my anti-vehicle garden algorithm, a fitting name for what would become the most satisfying code I'd ever deployed. The trap was taking shape in my mind, a rainbow surprise for the woman who couldn't resist driving where she didn't belong. The morning after the July 4th confrontation, I woke with a clear mission. If legal channels, community pressure, and direct confrontation wouldn't stop Diane's persistent trespassing, perhaps a more creative approach would. I needed a solution that would be effective, legal, and ideally documentable for the growing audience of neighbors who were watching our conflict unfold. As a programmer who specialized in systems design, I approached the problem methodically, like debugging particularly stubborn code. First, I called Samantha for legal advice. I need to understand exactly what constitutes allowable property protection measures, I explained, outlining my general idea without specific details. She directed me to Section 23, Paragraph 4 of the HOA guideline. Homeowners may utilize non-permanent, non-harmful aesthetic deterrents to protect landscaping elements from damage. The language was vague enough to provide coverage for what I had in mind, while still operating within the letter of the rules. Just make sure whatever you're planning doesn't cause actual harm or permanent damage, Samantha cautioned. Diane would love nothing more than a legitimate reason to escalate this to a legal matter. Next, I consulted Thomas about potential liability issues. Non-toxic biodegradable materials that don't permanently damage property or cause injury should keep you within bounds of reasonable self-defense of property, he advised. Document everything. Your intent, the materials used, the specific targeting mechanism. Make it clear this is designed solely to identify and document trespassers, not to cause harm. His guidance shaped my approach, ensuring I created a system that was defensive rather than aggressive in nature. With the legal groundwork established, I ordered supplies, highly concentrated food-grade color powder in 5 vibrant hues, similar to what's used in color run events, biodegradable compressed air canisters, and pressure-sensitive plates that would activate only under the specific weight of a vehicle between 1,500 and 2,500 pounds, eliminating any risk of triggering from pedestrians, pets, or wildlife. While waiting for deliveries, I programmed my anti-vehicle garden algorithm, a system to calculate precise pressure thresholds and optimal powder distribution patterns based on typical vehicle entry angles across my lawn. The technical aspects were challenging but gratifying. I designed a system where multiplied pressure plates would need to be activated in a specific sequence to trigger the release mechanism, ensuring it would only deploy for a vehicle following Diane's exact path across my lawn. The colored powder would be propelled upward and outward through small tubes positioned just below ground level, creating a spectacular rainbow effect while clearly marking the trespassing vehicle. The entire system was weather-protected, solar-powered, and designed to capture video simultaneously from multiple angles when triggered. The installation took 2 days of careful, discreet work. I positioned the components during early morning hours when few neighbors were active, disguising my efforts as routine lawn maintenance. The pressure plates were buried just beneath the soil along Diane's usual cutting path, while the powder dispensers were concealed among border plants with spray nozzles barely visible above ground. I tested the system repeatedly with different weights, ensuring it would only activate under conditions that precisely matched a vehicle crossing the lawn. Nothing more, nothing less. The morning after completion, I was both nervous and exhilarated. Would Diane take her usual shortcut? Had I calculated the triggering pressure correctly? Around 8:15, right on schedule, Diane's white Mercedes appeared at the corner of my street. I watched through my home office window as she approached, slowed slightly at the corner where she would normally turn, then deliberately swerved onto my lawn as she had dozens of times before. The moment her front tires crossed the first pressure plate, I held my breath. What happened next exceeded my wildest expectations. As the vehicle reached the center of my lawn, the system deployed perfectly. Multiple jets of brilliantly colored powder exploded upward in sequence, creating a cascading rainbow effect that completely enveloped her white Mercedes. Red, blue, yellow, green, and purple clouds billowed around the car, settling on every surface and transforming the pristine vehicle into a psychedelic masterpiece. Through the multicolored haze, I could see Diane's face transition from confusion to shock to absolute fury. She slammed on the brakes, causing the car to skid slightly in the wet grass and triggering a secondary powder release I'd programmed as a contingency. The Mercedes was now encased in color from bumper to bumper with particular concentration on the windshield and driver's side window. Diane threw open her door and stumbled out, coughing and sputtering, her beige pantsuit now a Jackson Pollock-esque canvas of vibrant hues. "What have you done?" she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. "You're going to pay for this. I'm calling the police." Neighbors emerged from nearby houses drawn by the commotion. Cell phones appeared, recording the spectacle from multiple angles. Michael's young daughter, playing in their front yard, shrieked with delight. "Rainbow on wheels. The rainbow car is so pretty." Other children joined in, pointing and laughing at the transformed vehicle, while parents struggled to maintain straight faces. Even Brian, who had just pulled into his driveway across the street, stood frozen beside his car, briefcase in hand, staring in disbelief at his wife and her chromatic chariot. I calmly stepped outside, phone in hand, already recording, and approached Diane with deliberate slowness. "Are you all right, Diane? You seem to have driven across my lawn again, despite my numerous requests to stop." I installed a trespassing identification system as permitted under Section 23 of the HOA guidelines. It's completely non-toxic and biodegradable. Rinses off with water, though I imagine white automotive paint might retain some colorful memories. Diane was almost incoherent with rage, jabbing her finger at me while color powder drifted from her hair with each movement. "You've destroyed my car. This is vandalism, assault. I'm calling James right now, and you'll be arrested before that smirk leaves your face." She fumbled for her phone, which was now decorated with colorful fingerprints, and dialed frantically. To everyone's surprise, the police officer who responded wasn't Lieutenant Miller, but a young female officer named Rivera, who seemed determined to follow proper procedure. She documented the scene methodically, taking statements from multiple witnesses, examining my lawn, and reviewing the HOA guidelines I provided. When Diane demanded my immediate arrest, Officer Rivera remained professional. "Ma'am, from multiple witness statements and the evidence presented, it appears you were driving across private property after repeated warnings to stop. The deterrent system Mr. Turner installed appears to comply with HOA regulations for non-harmful landscape protection measures." Diane's face contorted with disbelief. "Are you serious? Look at my car! Look at me! This is destruction of property." Officer Rivera nodded patiently. "I understand you're upset, but the substance appears to be non-toxic temporary color powder. If you wish to file a civil claim for cleaning costs, that would be handled through small claims court, not criminal charges. Meanwhile, Mr. Turner would be within his rights to file charges for repeated trespassing and property damage based on the documentation he's provided." As this exchange unfolded, more neighbors gathered, many openly enjoying Diane's comeuppance. Jessica Parker was working overtime, moving from group to group, ensuring everyone heard every detail. Samantha arrived and quietly confirmed to Officer Rivera that my system did indeed comply with HOA regulations. Even Brian maintained his distance, clearly unwilling to publicly defend his wife's behavior this time. When Officer Rivera finally left after issuing Diane a warning for trespassing, the neighborhood remained abuzz with excitement. I returned to my house, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and apprehension. The rainbow trap had worked exactly as designed. It had documented Diane's trespassing in the most visible way possible, embarrassed her publicly, and shifted neighborhood sentiment decisively in my favor. But I knew Diane well enough by now to understand this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of the final battle, and she would pull out all stops to retaliate. As expected that evening, I received notice of an emergency HOA meeting called for the following night with a single agenda item: disciplinary action against homeowner Ryan Turner for malicious property damage and conduct unbecoming a community member. The community center was packed beyond capacity for the emergency HOA meeting. Residents who had never attended before, crowded and drawn by Jessica's colorful, literally descriptions of yesterday's events and the circulating cell phone videos of Diane emerging from her rainbow-covered Mercedes. An atmosphere of barely suppressed excitement hummed through the room, with clusters of neighbors whispering and occasionally glancing toward Diane, who sat rigidly at the board table, her hair still faintly tinged with blue, despite what must have been extensive washing. She had replaced her ruined beige suit with an austere black ensemble that only highlighted the lingering color stains on her neck and hands. I arrived early, accompanied by Michael, Thomas, and Samantha, who had temporarily recused herself from the board for this meeting due to her prior consultation with the homeowner in question. We had spent the previous evening preparing, gathering documentation, and planning our approach. Diane might have called this meeting expecting to railroad through some punitive measure against me, but we intended to turn it into a referendum on her leadership instead. Brian sat apart from Diane at the board table, his expression unreadable. The remaining 3 board members, all Diane loyalists who rarely spoke, seemed uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with the crowd. At precisely 7 o'clock, Diane called the meeting to order, her voice tight with controlled anger. We are here to address the unconscionable actions of homeowner Ryan Turner, who yesterday deployed a destructive device that caused extensive damage to personal property and created a public hazard. The board will hear testimony and then vote on appropriate penalties, which may include significant fines, liens against the property, and potential legal action. Before she could continue, Thomas stood. Point of order, Madam President. According to HOA Bylaw Article 5, any disciplinary hearing must first establish that an actual violation of specific written HOA rules occurred. I move that before any testimony is heard, the board identify the exact written rule allegedly violated. It was a procedural maneuver designed to force Diane to admit she was operating on emotion rather than established guidelines. Her eyes narrowed as she shuffled through papers, clearly searching for something applicable. Section 17 prohibits any action that damages personal property or residence, she finally stated. Thomas nodded politely. That section refers to damage of property located on HOA common grounds or rightfully positioned on another's property. It does not apply to vehicles trespassing on private property against the owner's repeated objections. Perhaps you'd like to try again. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. Most had never seen anyone challenge Diane so effectively on procedural grounds, her usual weapon of choice. Flustered but determined, Diane shifted tactics. Mr. Turner installed a device designed to damage vehicles without board approval, violating architectural guidelines. Samantha rose next. Actually, I reviewed this matter beforehand. The system in question was temporary, non-permanent, caused no lasting damage, and falls under permanent landscape protection measures, in Section 23, Paragraph 4. She distributed copies of the relevant section to the board members. Additionally, as Mr. Turner's security footage demonstrates, the system was calibrated to activate only when a vehicle drove across his lawn following a specific path repeatedly taken by your vehicle, Diane. For the next hour, the meeting devolved into exactly what we had hoped for, a comprehensive examination of not just yesterday's incident, but the pattern of behavior leading up to it. Neighbors I had never spoken to stood to recount their own experiences with Diane's selective rule enforcement. The accountant detailed financial discrepancies in HOA records. Michael described Diane's intimidation of his student. Throughout it all, Diane became increasingly agitated, interrupting speakers and dismissing allegations without addressing their substance. The turning point came unexpectedly from Brian. After listening to multiple testimonies, he cleared his throat and addressed the room. As some of you know, I have always supported my wife's dedication to maintaining neighborhood standards. However, I cannot in good conscience continue to ignore what I've recently discovered. He placed a folder on the table. Seats, the receipts for personal purchases made with HOA funds. Landscaping for our home, a weekend spa retreat classified as an administrative planning session, catering for our daughter's graduation party listed as a community event. There's more, but you get the idea. The room fell silent, as Diane stared at her husband in shock. "Brian, what are you doing?" she hissed. He didn't meet her eyes. The right thing, Diane. Finally, he turned to address the stunned audience. I discovered these discrepancies months ago, but convinced myself they were misunderstandings or justifiable expenses. I was wrong. When I saw what happened with Michael's student, then witnessed yesterday's incident, which by the way occurred because my wife has been deliberately driving across Ryan's lawn for months, despite his repeated requests to stop. I knew I couldn't remain silent anymore. Diane's composure finally shattered completely. This is absurd. This is a conspiracy orchestrated by him. She jabbed a finger in my direction. He moves in here and suddenly everyone forgets everything I've done for this community. The property values I've maintained, the standards I've upheld, and you're all turning against me because of some colored powder and a few accounting errors. Her voice had risen to a near shout, her face flushed with anger. Samantha seized the moment. I moved for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current HOA president as permitted under Article 7 during cases of alleged financial impropriety. A second board member, to everyone's surprise, quickly seconded the motion. Diane appeared genuinely shocked, clearly having expected her appointed board members to remain loyal regardless of evidence. You can't do this. This meeting was called to address his violations. Not the motion has been seconded. Thomas interrupted smoothly. According to procedures, we moved directly to a vote of all homeowners present. What followed was a watershed moment for Meadow Creek Estates, a public ballot where residents openly voted on whether to remove Diane from her position. The result wasn't even close. 87% voted for her immediate removal, with only a handful of her closest allies standing in opposition. As the reality of her defeat became clear, Diane gathered her papers with shaking hands. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice suddenly quiet but intense. "All of you, this neighborhood will fall apart without proper leadership. And you," she turned to me. "You orchestrated all of this because you couldn't handle a simple request to improve your property. I will sue you personally for every cent of damage to my car and my reputation." Without waiting for a response, she stormed out of the meeting room, the door slamming behind her. Brian remained seated, looking simultaneously relieved and devastated. "I apologize to everyone who was hurt by actions I should have addressed sooner," he said simply. "I'll make sure all misappropriated funds are repaid in full." He then followed his wife out, though with considerably more dignity. With Diane gone, the meeting shifted to reconstruction. Samantha was unanimously elected interim president until formal elections could be held. A committee was formed to review all HOA rules and financial records with an emphasis on transparency and reasonable enforcement. And to my surprise, several neighbors nominated me to join the board, citing my creative problem-solving skills and commitment to fairness. The meeting that had been called to punish me had instead resulted in community renewal, and my rainbow trap had been the catalyst that made it possible. As people filed out afterward, many stopped to shake my hand or share their own Diane stories that they'd been too intimidated to tell before. Thomas patted my shoulder approvingly. "You didn't just defend your lawn, son. You gave this neighborhood back its voice." Looking around at the energized, chatting residents, I realized he was right. What had started as a simple dispute over tire tracks had evolved into something much more significant. A community reclaiming itself from the grip of a petty tyrant, and somehow I had found myself at the center of it all, covered in much less rainbow powder than Diane, but playing a crucial role nonetheless. In the weeks following Diane's dramatic removal, Meadow Creek Estates underwent a remarkable transformation. Under Samantha's interim leadership, and with input from the newly formed Rules Review Committee, of which I was now a member, we began dismantling the labyrinth of arbitrary restrictions that had accumulated during Diane's tenure. The HOA guidelines were streamlined from 127 pages down to a reasonable 35, focusing on essential community standards, while allowing homeowners greater freedom to express their individuality through their properties. Dan didn't disappear quietly. Of course, she attempted to file a lawsuit against me for damage to her Mercedes, but the case was quickly dismissed when her own repeated trespassing was established through my extensive documentation. She then tried to rally support for a counter-movement among her remaining allies. But without her position of authority and access to HOA funds, her influence rapidly diminished. The final blow came when the forensic accountant we hired discovered Diane had misappropriated over $27,000 of HOA funds over 6 years. A finding that led to a demand for full restitution and the threat of criminal charges if she didn't comply. Brian, to his credit, immediately arranged to repay the full amount, adding a substantial personal contribution to the HOA reserve fund as a gesture of goodwill. He and Diane separated shortly thereafter, with Brian moving temporarily into a condo downtown, while Diane remained in their house, increasingly isolated from the community she had once controlled. Rumors circulated that they had listed their home with a realtor, though no for sale sign had yet appeared. As summer transitioned to fall, we held our first neighborhood event under the new leadership, a potluck barbecue in the community park. Unlike previous HOA functions, which had been tightly controlled affairs where Diane dictated everything from acceptable food items to seating arrangements, this gathering had a relaxed, genuinely communal atmosphere. Children played freely on the grass. Adults mingled across social boundaries that had previously seemed impenetrable, and there was a palpable sense of relief and renewal throughout the park. During the barbecue, Samantha asked me to say a few words, standing before my neighbors, many of whom had been strangers just months ago. I found myself reflecting on the unexpected journey we'd shared. When I moved to Meadow Creek, I was just looking for a quiet place to rebuild my life. I never imagined I'd end up in a color powder showdown with the HOA president or helping rewrite community bylaws. But I've realized something important through all this chaos. A good neighborhood isn't defined by its rules or property values, but by how we treat each other. I looked around at the nodding faces. We need to ask ourselves, where do we want to live? In a neighborhood ruled by fear, where we're afraid to express ourselves or connect with our neighbors? Or in a place where everyone can be themselves, contribute their unique perspectives, and support each other? I know which one I choose. The applause that followed suggested I wasn't alone in that choice. After my impromptu speech, several residents approached to share their own stories of how Diane's regime had affected them. An elderly gentleman had been afraid to install a ramp for his wife's wheelchair because it didn't conform to aesthetic guidelines. A young family had been repeatedly fined for their children's basketball hoop, despite having nowhere else for the kids to play. A retired teacher had abandoned her plans for a butterfly garden after being told it would attract undesirable insects. Each person expressed not just relief at being freed from these restrictions, but excitement about finally feeling at home in their own neighborhood. One morning, a few weeks after the barbecue, I was surprised to find Diane standing on my front porch when I opened the door to collect my newspaper. She looked different, subdued, without her usual perfectly coordinated outfit and immaculate makeup. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Wary but curious, I invited her in, offering coffee, which she declined with a slight shake of her head. "Brian and I are moving," she said without preamble. "We've accepted an offer on the house. Before we leave, I wanted to clear the air." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Diane, even this acknowledgement was unexpected. She explained that losing her position in the HOA had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about herself and her behavior. "I still think this neighborhood needed strong leadership," she insisted, a flash of her old self showing through, "but perhaps my methods became." As she spoke, I noticed her eyes darting occasionally toward my desk, where some HOA financial documents were spread out, papers that detailed the extent of her misappropriation. Suddenly, her visit made more sense. "Diane," I interrupted gently, "if you're worried about those files, they've already been submitted to the board. Whatever you're hoping to retrieve or alter, it's too late." Her expression froze, then crumpled slightly, confirming my suspicion. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about damage control. "You've ruined everything," she said, her momentary vulnerability hardening back into resentment. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked to make this neighborhood what it was? The standards I maintained, the property values I protected, and you destroyed it all with your childish rainbow prank and your rabble-rousing." I could have argued, pointed out her financial misconduct, her bullying, her selective enforcement of rules. Instead, I simply said, I think the neighborhood is finally becoming what it always should have been, a community, not a kingdom. She left without another word. But our final confrontation spread quickly through Jessica's efficient gossip network. When Diane and Brian's moving truck arrived the following weekend, an impromptu neighborhood gathering formed to watch, not out of malice or celebration, but out of a collective sense of closure. As the last boxes were loaded, and Diane climbed into her car, now restored to its original white, though with a faint multicolored sheen visible in certain light, a spontaneous ripple of applause moved through the assembled neighbors. It wasn't mean-spirited. It felt more like the release of a long-held breath, an acknowledgement that a difficult chapter had finally ended. In the months that followed, I transformed my front yard, the original battleground, into a small community gathering space with a free library box, comfortable benches under a pergola, and a vibrant garden filled with native plants that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. The corner where Diane had repeatedly driven her Mercedes became the site of a circular mosaic stepping stone path, created as a community art project, with contributions from dozens of residents. Children were especially proud of their colorful additions, with Michael's daughter insisting on using all rainbow colors in her section like the magic car. The video of Diane emerging from her rainbow-covered Mercedes had indeed gone viral on social media, garnering millions of views and spawning countless memes. I declined interviews from several news outlets, preferring to let the incident speak for itself. When pressed by one persistent reporter about my motivation for the rainbow trap, I gave a response that became almost as popular as the video itself. I didn't destroy her car, I just helped it express its true personality. Kind of like I helped the neighborhood see the true face of misused power. At the one-year anniversary of what residents now jokingly called the Rainbow Revolution, we held a neighborhood block party. Samantha, now officially elected as HOA president, presented me with a whimsical award, a miniature white car covered in rainbow glitter inside a snow globe. For outstanding contributions to neighborhood cohesion through creative problem-solving, the plaque read. We all laughed, but there was truth behind the humor. What had started as a defense of my property rights had catalyzed a complete community transformation. As I looked around at my neighbors, now friends, enjoying the celebration, I reflected on how differently things might have turned out. If I had given up and moved away, as so many before me had done, Diane would still be ruling with her clipboard and arbitrary rules. If I had responded with equal vindictiveness, the conflict might have escalated into something truly destructive for everyone involved. Instead, my rainbow trap had exposed the situation in a way that was impossible to ignore, but didn't cause lasting harm. A colorful revelation of truth that allowed the community to see clearly and choose a different path forward. Sometimes I amused as children played freely on lawns that had once been forbidden territory. The most effective way to fight darkness isn't with more darkness, but with a splash of unexpected